okay? I could go on and on about some of the things that Woods talks about, but let's get to the books. Let's get to something that I'm reading right now called Shantaram by Gregory David Roberts. And I'm going to reread the blurb in the front for you, just so you get an idea of what this book is about. Gregory David Roberts, like the hero of his novel, spent many years as a fugitive. In 1978, after his divorce, losing custody of his daughter and being convicted of a series of robberies committed to support his heroin habit, he was jailed in an Australian maximum security prison and sentenced to 19 years. In 1980, he escaped over the prison's front wall and for the next 10 years eluded authorities, living in New Zealand, Asia, Africa, and Europe, but for most of that time in Bombay, where he established a free medical clinic for slum dwellers and worked as a counterfeiter, smuggler, gunrunner, and street soldier for the Bombay Mafia. He was finally captured in Germany and served out his sentence there and in Australia, during which time he wrote Shantaram. He's now a full-time writer and lives in Bombay. So this book is about an actual occurrence. It's an autobiographical story made into fiction, okay? And I've mentioned already that I am interested in this genre because I'm writing in this genre, okay? My novel of life, which is the book I'm writing online, is autobiographical fiction. Now, one of the ways that the narrator in this book, called Lindsay, a man from Australia, as we said, gets around that tension that Woods talks about between the author and the literary author, using literary language, and the main character, or the narrator, who might not be a writer, is to make the narrator a writer. Now, this narrator he tells us in, I believe it is the second chapter, that he is a writer. And so that, in a sense, gets around all this tension of creating a story that is literary. But there's really nothing overly literary about this novel, and the language doesn't draw attention to itself. I'll even talk further about issues of style within this book. But let's read this section where the narrator mentions to us that he actually is a writer. During the time since the escape, and this is the escape I just talked to you about, escaping from prison, I'd learned that telling people a small part of the truth, I'd learned that telling people a small part of the truth, that I was a writer, provided me with a useful and flexible cover story. It was vague enough to explain extended stays or sudden departures, and the word research was comprehensive enough to account for inquiries about certain subjects, such as transport and travel, and the availability of false documents that I was sometimes forced to make. Moreover, the cover story guaranteed me a measure of privacy. The simple threat to tell people at length of my work in progress usually discouraged all but the most persistently curious. And I was a writer. In Australia, I'd written since my early 20s. I'd just begun to establish myself through my first published work when my marriage collapsed. I lost the custody of my daughter, and I lost my life in drugs, crime, imprisonment, and escape. But even as a fugitive, writing was still a daily custom and part of my instinctual routine. Even there, in Leopold's, my pockets were full of notes, scribbled onto napkins, receipts, and scraps of paper. I never stopped writing. So he mentions Leopold's, and that's where the second chapter of this novel opens. Leopold's, now we're in Bombay, okay? And an extremely crowded city, okay? Flooded with all sorts of languages, multitudes of people and multitudes of colors, ethnicities, languages. There's a very cosmopolitan, global setting to a underground bar in Bombay, and that's what Leopold's is. It's an underground bar. It's a sort of meeting place for mafia people and all sorts of different foreigners let me give you an idea. Let me describe this bar called Leopold's. Leopold's was the largest bar and restaurant in Colaba, and one of the largest in the city. The rectangular ground floor room occupied a frontage equal to any 4 other restaurants and was served by 2 metal doors that rolled up into wooden arches to give an expansive view of the causeway, Colaba's busiest and most colorful street. There was a smaller, more discreet air-conditioned bar on the first floor, supported by sturdy columns that divided the ground floor, into roughly equal sections, and around which many of the tables were grouped. Mirrors on those pillars and on much of the free wall space provided the patrons with one of the bar's major attractions, the chance to inspect, admire, and ogle others in circumspect, if not entirely anonymous fashion. For many, the duplication of their own images in 2 or more mirrors at the same time was not least among the pleasures of the pastime. Leopold's was a place for people to see, to be seen, and to see themselves in the act of being seen. And then he goes on to describe this bar and the people inside of it. Indian prostitutes garlanded with ropes of jasmine flowers and plumply wrapped in bejeweled saris were prohibited downstairs, and only accompanied customers to the upstairs bar. European prostitutes were only permitted to sit downstairs, attracting the interest of men who sat at other tables or simply paused on the street. Deals for drugs and other contraband were openly transacted at the tables, but the goods could only be exchanged outside the bar. It was common enough to see buyer and seller reach agreement on price, walk outside to hand over money and goods, and then walk back inside to resume their places at the table. So you're starting to get an idea of what this bar is like, and we're